Picture this: the deck of a pirate ship rolling under a merciless sun, the stink of blood thick in the air, and a man screaming as his leg is sawn off. No anesthetic, no clean instruments, just a rusty blade, a bottle of rum, and the steady hands of a pirate surgeon. You'd think pirates only lived for plunder and rum. But here's the forbidden truth. On the high seas, survival meant embracing a world of medicine so brutal, so ingenious, and so terrifying that it kept legends alive long enough to fight another day. Now, lean closer, because what I'm about to tell you isn't in the glossy tales of Hollywood. Pirate surgeons weren't saints in white coats. They were butchers, carpenters, even cooks pressed into the role of healer when cannonballs tore through flesh or cutlasses split bone. They boiled knives over lantern flames, stuffed gunpowder into open wounds to cauterize them, and used magatsius to eat away rotting flesh before it poisoned the blood. And yet, against all odds, some of these men became masters of a grisly craft, inventing procedures that would later inspire real naval medicine. Imagine lying on that deck, waves slamming the hull, hearing your own bone crack under the saw while your shipmates held you down. Rum poured down your throat, not for kindness, but to keep you from biting through your tongue. And here's the twist: some survived. Some even fought again days later, hobbling on peg legs, swinging cutlasses with arms scarred by fire and blade. These weren't miracles. They were the work of pirate surgeons, half demons, half saviors. But their story is darker still, because the same hands that saved a man could kill him in an instant. The same saw used for amputation doubled as an executioner's tool when discipline failed. And whispers say that some surgeons made their own grim experiments in the dead of night, testing remedies on prisoners or crewmates too weak to fight back. So what was life like under the blade of a pirate surgeon? How much pain could a man endure when death and survival were both waiting at the tip of a knife? That's the secret I'll take you into now. The Caribbean sun hung mercilessly over the rolling deck of the Black Widow, its heat pressing down like a curse. But the screams that split the air came not from the heavens, but from the man sprawled across the planks, his leg mangled into a ruin of flesh and shattered bone by a splintering cannonball. His shipmates gripped his arms and shoulders, their faces pale, eyes wide with dread, for they knew what was coming. "Hold him steady," growled Elias Finch, the so-called surgeon of the crew, a man with no formal training, no parchment or seal, only the iron stomach and grim determination it took to cut men apart and somehow keep them alive. His tools lay on a stained cloth: a carpenter's saw, a butcher's knife, a handful of needles bent from sail-making, and a bottle of raw rum. There was no anesthetic, no mercy, only the crude hope that speed and steel could outrun death. Finch poured a splash of rum over the jagged wound, the liquid sizzling in the torn flesh as the sailor shrieked so loud the gulls wheeled overhead, startled from their perches. "Drink," Finch barked, shoving the bottle into the man's mouth. He gagged but swallowed, choking on fire that dulled the edges of agony if only for a moment. Then, without hesitation, Finch pressed the saw to the thigh just above the ruined mess and began to cut. The sound was sickening, a rasp of steel through bone, the wet scrape of sinew tearing on. The man's body arched, veins bulging in his neck as his screams rose to the sky. Sailors pinned him down, teeth gritted, some turning away, others whispering prayers they had long abandoned. Blood gushed hot and bright, splattering the planks, soaking Finch's sleeves. But his face remained impassive, his movements steady. He had done this before, too many times, and he knew hesitation was a killer. Faster, faster, one of the men begged, but Finch ignored him, teeth clenched as he sawed in rhythm, sweat dripping from his brow. When at last the leg came free, dropping with a dull thud to the deck, a cheer rose from some throats, but it was hollow, swallowed by the sight of the man convulsing, blood spurting in deadly rhythm. Without pause, Finch pressed a red-hot knife heated in the galley, fire against the stump. The hiss of burning flesh filled the air, the stench gagging even the hardened sailors, and the wounded man's scream cut off as he finally fell unconscious. Smoke curling from his body as though his very soul were being seared away. "Bind it," Finch snapped, and cloth was wrapped tight. The bleeding slowed. The wound closed in a grotesque parody of healing. "He'll live," Finch muttered, wiping sweat and blood from his brow. "If the rot doesn't take him." And that was the truth of pirate surgery. Survival was a coin toss. Infection as deadly as any blade, yet against odds some did live. Hobbling days later on crude peg legs carved from oak, their scars badges of honor, their survival proof of the surgeon's dark craft. But what haunted the men was not just the pain of the saved, it was the memory of those who weren't. For every man who staggered back into the fight, 2 more were buried at sea, stitched into canvas and tipped into the depths. And whispers spread among the crew that Finch had grown too cold, too curious, that sometimes he cut deeper than he had to, that sometimes he lingered when a man was beyond saving, as if testing how much agony flesh could bear. No one dared say it to his face, for in a world where death lurked in every wave and cannon's roar, the surgeon was both demon and angel, feared and needed in equal measure. One night, after a raid gone bloody, Jack Holloway Carter sat nursing a deep cut across his ribs, watching Finch stitch another man with hands steady as stone. "Tell me true, Finch," Carter rasped. "Do you ever care if they live, or is it just the cutting you love?" Finch looked up, his eyes flat as the sea on a windless day, and said only, "A surgeon cares for the ship, not the man. A live body fights another day. A dead one feeds the fish. That's all there is." His words chilled the men who heard them, but no one argued, because, in the world of pirates, truth was often cruel. Still, some part of the crew wondered, had they traded the mercy of the sea for the knife of a butcher in surgeon's guise? And as the Black Widow sailed into another storm of war, each man knew that should fate wound him, it would not be God's hand he fell into, but Finch's hand. Perhaps that was the greater terror. The night after the amputation, as the wounded man moaned in fever and the ship creaked in the swell, one sailor whispered to another, "Better to die quick by the cannon than slow by his saw." The other shuddered, glancing at Finch's shadow moving in lantern light. "Aye," he muttered, "but the sea gives no choice. Only the surgeon does." And somewhere in the darkness, Finch sharpened his blades by the glow of a guttering candle, his expression unreadable, as if already preparing for the next man fate would send to his table. The lower deck of the Black Widow reeked of sickness, a suffocating mixture of blood, sweat, vomit, and the sour stink of salt-soaked wood that had never been truly dry since the storm. And every step squelched on planks, sticky with fluids no one dared name, and here, in this stinking coffin, men who had once roared with laughter and fury in battle now groaned and whimpered like children, their bodies slick with fever, their eyes glazed as though they already stared beyond the veil. And Elias Finch, the so-called surgeon, stalked among them with the patience of a man who had stopped smelling death long ago. his hands dark with stains that would never wash away, his eyes flat as a shark's, carrying with him jars wrapped in damp cloth that wriggled and pulsed with life. Jars that made grown pirates shudder because inside was not treasure, not rum, not gold, but maggots, fat, writhing, hungry. And when Finch knelt beside a man whose stump was blackening with rot, when he pulled the cloth from the jar and scooped a writhing handful, pressing the larvae directly into the wound, the sailor pinned to the hammock screamed until his throat cracked and the others turned away, muttering prayers to saints they had long abandoned. But Finch only hissed, "Hold him still," and the crew obeyed, forcing the man down while the white worms burrowed into the decaying flesh, their tiny bodies writhing as they devoured what disease had already claimed. And when one man retched into a bucket, another whispered hoarsely, "Better them things eat him than the rot eat us all." And though the sight turned stomachs, the truth was undeniable. Days later, the fevered man still lived, pale and trembling but alive, and the wound that had once stunk of death now smelled of raw flesh and brine. And the crew began to look at Finch not only with fear but with awe, as if he commanded some unholy pact with life itself. Yet survival was never free, and Finch's methods were as varied as they were cruel, because in truth he was no surgeon born of study or parchment but of necessity, a man who stitched with sailmakers' needles, who boiled knives in lantern flame, who cauterized with rum and pitch, who forced men to swallow powders and herbs stolen from merchant holds, sometimes saving them, sometimes killing them, and every attempt was a gamble, every cure an experiment, and the crew knew, with dread in their guts, that they were his subjects, his living test. And one night when the fever swept the hold after days of rain and soaked rations, when men shivered with blue lips and coughed until blood flecked their chins, Carter, the hollow-eyed pirate who had once challenged Finch's lack of mercy, cornered him by lantern light and rasped, "Do something, or we'll all be corpses by week's end." And Finch looked up, his shadow long across the planks, and in his eyes there was no pity, only calculation, as he muttered, "I need a test." And the crew fell silent because they knew what that meant. For chained in the bilge was a Spanish prisoner taken in their last raid, a gaunt, furious man who spat curses at them in his tongue. And it was upon him that Finch now turned, dragging him up screaming, forcing a concoction of boiled bark and bitter herbs down his throat, ignoring his choking and gagging while the crew looked on in horror, some crossing themselves, others pretending not to see. And when the prisoner writhed and foamed and died hours later, Finch calmly made notes on a scrap of parchment, muttering about dosage and timing, words the others barely understood, then turned to a sailor already half dead with fever and tried again, this time cutting open the man's arm to bleed him before pouring the same brew mixed with raw rum into his mouth. And by dawn the man still breathed, shivering but alive, and Finch nodded to himself as if the death of one and the survival of another were equal coins on his scale. And the crew, though disgusted, cheered faintly, because in their world survival was currency, and no one dared deny the results. Still, whispers spread like smoke that Finch was less a healer than a devil, that he cared nothing for mercy, only for the experiment, that he watched men die not with sorrow but with hunger in his eyes, and sailors began to mutter in hammocks, "Better to die quick by cannon than slow by his saw." But none dared confront him, because the truth was more terrifying without Finch. They were nothing but dead men waiting to drop. And so they bore his experiments, his jars of crawling maggots, his boiling of rum into blackened syrup he claimed would draw the sickness out, his cutting and stitching, his burning and bleeding, all endured because some lived. And on a pirate ship, even a chance at life was worth the price of screams. But fear grew in other ways, too, because as the storm passed and the fever eased, some men swore they had seen Finch at night by the guttering lantern, sharpening his blades and staring at the sleeping crew with eyes that did not see comrades but subjects, as if he wondered what would happen if he cut here or there, how much blood a man could lose before he faded, how much pain the body could endure before the soul slipped free. And one night Carter woke to find Finch standing over him, blade in hand. And though Finch muttered he was only checking the bandage, Carter swore he had seen something in his eyes, something hungry, something that whispered of a surgeon who had long ago stepped past the line between saving life and mastering death. And when Carter told the tale to others the next day, men spat over their shoulders and muttered of curses, but none dared challenge Finch openly. For when the next raid came and steel clashed on another deck, it was Finch again who sewed them back together, who poured fire into wounds, who stuffed maggots into rot, who tore screams from their throats only to return them to life, and so they endured, caught between fear of the surgeon and fear of the sea, until one evening, as the sun bled red into the horizon and the gulls wheeled overhead, Finch emerged from the hold with blood up to his elbows, his eyes unreadable, and muttered to Carter, "I think I've found a cure for the fever," then turned back below, leaving Carter and the others staring at each other in dread, because none of them knew whether the cure would save them, or damn them all. The sea was mercilessly calm the night Finch unveiled his so-called cure, the Black Widow drifting under a swollen moon that painted the deck silver and the sails pale as ghosts. And below, in the foul-smelling hold, men lay moaning in hammocks, their skin slick with fever, eyes rolling, some muttering prayers, others too weak even to whisper, while the surgeon moved among them with the quiet purpose of a man already resigned to the screams that would follow. His tools laid out on a stained cloth beside his lantern, blades of every size, crude needles, blackened thread, jars of maggots writhing like pale fire in the dim light, and at the center a small pouch of powdered bark stolen from a Spanish merchant's chest, bitter stuff that Finch had mixed into a black slurry of rum and seawater, claiming it would drive out the rot from the blood. And though the men muttered and spat about witchcraft, though Carter hissed that he would rather drown than drink the poison, still they obeyed. Because what choice did pirates have when sickness spread like wildfire, already cutting down 5 men in as many days, their bodies stitched into canvas and dropped overboard with stones tied to their ankles, the sea swallowing them without care. And so, when Finch gripped a trembling sailor named Duffy by the jaw, forcing the foul brew past his lips, the others watched with wide, terrified eyes, waiting to see if death or salvation would follow. And the man gagged, coughed, choked, but did not die. And Finch only muttered, "Good, good," like a priest offering a benediction, and moved to the next and the next, until 6 men had swallowed his potion, and then he waited, silent, sharpening his knife as the crew stared in horror at the sound of steel rasping stone, waiting for moans to turn into death rattles. But instead, by dawn, the fever had broken in 2 of them, their skin cooling, their eyes clearing, and the men who saw it crossed themselves, whispering that Finch had stolen the hand of God, while others hissed that he had bargained with the devil. But none could deny the truth. Where the maggots ate the flesh and the bark powder burned the fever, Survival followed, though the price was agony, and Finch's reputation grew darker and greater all at once. For now the crew feared him as a man who held their lives in jars and powders, who could drag them back from death with his devil's medicine, or send them into it with equal ease, and soon even the captain began to defer to him. For when a captain fell ill, who else could he turn to but the surgeon? And when Finch forced the black brew down his throat, when he sweated and cursed but lived, the crew understood that their fates were shackled to Finch's steady hands, and fear became obedience. Yet beneath that obedience grew whispers darker still, because some swore Finch was experimenting beyond necessity, that he cut into men not just to save but to learn, that he stitched wounds in patterns, pressed powders into cuts not to heal but to watch how flesh reacted. And one night Carter caught him with a dead man laid on the table, chest open, lantern light gleaming on ribs and organs glistening in the dark, and Finch's hands moved inside with the precision of a man dissecting a prize fish. And when Carter gasped, Finch did not flinch but looked up and said coldly, "If we are to fight death, we must know it." And Carter fled, bile rising in his throat, telling the others in whispers that their surgeon was no man at all, but some creature studying them like insects. And the men listened with haunted eyes, but still they did not rise against Finch, for they knew what mutiny against a surgeon meant: no one to stitch, no one to cut, no one to pour fire into wounds, and so they endured, and their fear twisted into something darker, a dependence like that of a slave to his master. And the sea rolled on, indifferent, while Finch's cures spread like a shadow through the crew, saving men but leaving scars, not only in flesh but in the soul, until one day a storm blew them into battle with a merchantman off Hispaniola, cannon fire ripping the air, splinters flying like knives, men screaming as iron tore through wood and bone, and the deck ran slick with blood once more, and Finch's table was crowded, his saw shrieking as he cut, his knife hissing as he burned, his powders forced down throats slick with vomit. And when dawn broke, they counted their dead and their living, and the balance was shocking, more alive than they had ever hoped. Men hobbling, limping, groaning but alive, and the crew whispered that Finch had cheated the sea itself. But in their eyes was a question darker than the storm clouds. What price had been paid in the night? What parts of their souls had been carved away under the surgeon's hand? And that night Carter cornered him again, voice hoarse, fury shaking him. "You keep us alive." "Aye, but what are we now? Men, or your damned experiments?" And Finch stared, his face unreadable, before whispering, "You are proof," and walked away, leaving Carter trembling with rage and fear. And as the Black Widow rolled on under the indifferent stars, the men lay awake, haunted by the sound of Finch's saw, wondering which of them would be the next to prove his theories. And the cliff they stood upon grew clearer with each passing day. Follow Finch and live as horrors, or defy him and die as men. And the choice, whispered in darkness, grew heavier than the sea itself. The Caribbean sun scorched the deck of the Black Widow until the very planks steamed. But below, in the stinking, lantern-lit gloom of the hold, the world was blood and shadow, and Elias Finch ruled it like a dark priest at his altar, his blades gleaming despite rust, his hands steady no matter how men screamed. And it was here that the crew began to whisper he was less surgeon and more devil. For though his cures had saved them from fevers, though his powders had broken the sickness that might have swallowed the ship whole, the price was growing heavier than coin. And one day that price became too clear when a boarding clash with a French brig left the deck awash in gore. Cannon smoke curling into the night, pirates and Frenchmen tangled in death. And by the time the guns fell silent and the prizes were hauled aboard, Finch's table was crowded once more. Limbs mangled, flesh torn, eyes wild with agony. And he barked for buckets of seawater, for rum, for fire, and the men obeyed, though their guts twisted at the thought. And one of the wounded, a boy barely 17 named Hollis, begged through tears, "Please, let me die quick." But Finch only shoved rum between his lips and muttered, "Not while I hold a blade," and set to work with saw and knife, sawing through bone as the boy shrieked until his voice broke, then pressing red-hot iron against the stump, the smoke rising, the smell of burning meat filling the air until even the hardened veterans gagged. And when at last the boy lay limp but breathing, Finch nodded to himself and turned to the next and the next. And for hours the ship rang not with victory songs but with screams that echoed down into the sea itself, until dawn bled red over the horizon and left the men hollow-eyed and trembling. Yet they whispered, "He keeps us alive, he keeps us alive," as if repeating it could absolve the horror of the night. But as days passed, the line between cure and cruelty blurred further, for Carter swore he had seen Finch cutting deeper than necessary, probing wounds with strange fascination, muttering to himself as if cataloguing secrets of the flesh. And when Carter confronted him, spitting, "You enjoy it, don't you? You loved the screams," Finch did not deny it, but only said coldly, "Pain teaches more than silence ever could," and walked away, leaving Carter shaking with rage, but too afraid to draw steel against the only man who could save them in the next fight. And then came the night that sealed the whispers into dread, when a storm trapped the crew below, with rain lashing the deck above, lightning splitting the sky, thunder booming like cannon fire. And in the flickering light of the lantern Finch called for 2 men, not sick, not wounded, but alive and strong, to help test a new mixture he had brewed from bark, salt, and gunpowder. And when they hesitated, he fixed them with a stare so cold they obeyed, swallowing his potion under the eyes of the crew, and one of them convulsed, blood frothing from his mouth before he collapsed stone dead, while the other sweated, trembled, then steadied, his fever breaking though he had none to start with, and Finch only murmured, "It works," while the rest of the crew stared in silence, horror thick as the storm outside. And from that night on, men watched their cups with suspicion, sniffing their rum before drinking, whispering that they would sooner risk the cannon than the surgeon's scalpel. But still they came crawling to him when the wounds tore them open, because choice was an illusion on the sea, and so the fear bound them tighter than chains. Anne Bonny herself once said that a pirate surgeon was half butcher, half god, and Finch was proof of it. But gods are fickle, and butchers always hungry. And as the ship rolled on into black waters, the crew could not shake the dread that one day Finch would run out of patience and turn, his scalpel on them, not to heal but to learn, not to save but to see what secrets lay hidden beneath their skin. And one night, when Carter woke to find the surgeon standing at the hammocks, blade glinting in lantern light, staring at the sleeping crew as if selecting cuts of meat, he whispered to the man beside him, "He'll be the death of us all," and the other only shuddered and said, "Aye, but until then, he keeps us alive." And in that paradox lay the doom of the Black Widow. For a crew that fears its surgeon more than the sea is a crew on the edge of breaking. And when the next storm of blood came, when cannonballs and cutlasses tore them open again, the question would not be who survived, but but whether they wanted to. The air aboard the Black Widow had grown heavy, thicker than the smoke of cannon fire, a stifling dread that clung to every plank and hammock. For by now the men feared not only the enemy's iron but the surgeon's blades, and every creak of the ship at night was haunted by the thought that Elias Finch was sharpening tools, somewhere in the shadows, waiting, and yet they still needed him more than they needed powder or sail. For wounds came as surely as waves, and death stalked every raid, and so the crew lived in a kind of feverish paradox, whispering hatred for him even as they carried their broken brothers to his table. But the whispers grew darker still when Carter, weary and hollow, told the others of what he had seen. Finch cutting open the dead not to honor them but to study them, muttering notes into the dark, pulling organs from bodies like a child prying shells from the sand. And though some cursed Carter for spreading fear, more nodded with dread, because they too had seen glimpses the surgeon's lantern burning long after the ship slept. The smell of smoke and charred flesh when no one was wounded, the wet scrape of knives on something more than wood. And it was then that the rumors began that Finch had made bargains with the sea, that he could not save without killing, that for every man who lived another must die. And though sailors spat such words as superstition, they said them anyway. For what else could explain the devil's precision of his work, the cold gleam in his eyes as he pressed maggots into wounds or forced men to drink black potions, half of them vomiting blood and the other half rising from death's door. And the crew began to keep count, whispering, 7 live, 7 dead, as though the scales must always balance. And one night, when the ship was becalmed under a sky black as ink, no stars above, no wind in the sails, Finch called 2 men to his table, both wounded but not fatally and, without warning, cut deeper than their hurts required, his blades slipping into their flesh while he muttered about testing resistance. And though the men screamed and cursed, though Carter lunged forward with fists clenched, the others dragged him back, hissing, "Do you want us all to die without him?" And Carter spat, "We're already dying with him." But still no one raised steel against the surgeon, because his grip on them was stronger than rope, his shadow larger than the captain's. And when one of the men survived and the other died, Finch only nodded, wiped his hands, and whispered, "Balance," and walked away, leaving the crew trembling. After that night the men stopped speaking openly, their fear pressed down into whispers. Mutters in the hammocks when lanterns dimmed, and Carter said quietly, "He'll cut us all in our sleep one night." But Briggs, the peg-legged pirate Finch had once saved, snapped back, "Better to be cut and live than left to rot," and the argument flared into a fistfight. Blood on the planks, and Finch himself stepped out of the dark, not to break them but to watch, his expression unreadable, until both men lay gasping. Then he said only, "Pain teaches," and turned away, his words colder than the sea itself. It was then the crew began to dream of mutiny, their thoughts spilling into murmurs. What if they tossed him overboard? What if they let the sea take him? What if they freed themselves from the surgeon's shadow? But every time the thought grew bold, another raid came, another battle, another round of screams that ended only under Finch's blades, and the men lived, scarred, broken, stitched together like ragged sails, but alive. And the mutiny withered on their tongues, for what is freedom if it ends in death? Yet the whispers did not die, they deepened, until some swore they heard them in the dark, not from men but from the surgeon himself, whispering to the bodies laid on his table, whispering to the jars of maggots, whispering to the sea beyond the hull as if he spoke to something that listened, And one stormy night, Carter swore he heard Finch praying not to God, but to the ocean, his words a low hiss. "Give me their lives, and I will give you their deaths." And when Carter told the others, fear gripped them so hard they clutched talismans they had long since abandoned. But still they went to Finch the next dawn when another man lost his arm to a misfired musket, because choice was a cruel illusion. The final straw came weeks later, when a boy no more than 16, fresh to the crew, was dragged to Finch with nothing but a shallow cut on his arm, a scratch that needed nothing more than a rag and rum. But Finch held him down, opened the wound wider, poured black powder into it, muttering about resistance, and when the boy screamed until his voice broke, Carter snapped, lunging with a blade, only to be stopped by Briggs and others who hissed, "If you kill him, we all die." And Carter, trembling, dropped his knife, but in his eyes burned the fire of men who had seen too much, who had carried too much silence, and he spat on the deck at Finch's feet, whispering, "One day the sea will claim you." Butcher and Finch, calm as ever, looked down and said, "The sea already has," and turned back to his work. And those words, spoken in the lantern's flicker, sank into every man's bones, for they realized then that the surgeon was not theirs at all, not bound to crew or captain, but to something deeper, darker, older than any of them. And the night closed heavy with the question no one dared ask aloud. When the sea came to balance its scales, would it take Finch, or would it take them all? The dawn that broke over the Black Widow was pale and sickly. Clouds smeared across the sky like ash, and the crew stirred from hammocks with hollow eyes, their bodies stitched and scarred, their spirits bent. And yet none dared speak above a whisper for fear the surgeon might be listening. And sure enough, as the light crept through the slats of the deck, Elias Finch was already at his table, blades gleaming, jars writhing, his hands steady as he cleaned instruments that would never be truly clean, and Carter, gaunt from sleepless nights, finally snapped, his voice low but burning, "We can't live like this," bound to his knives, waiting for the day he cuts us apart just to see what we're made of. And Briggs snarled back, "And without him, you'd already be shark bait," and the argument spread like fire. Men muttering, voices rising, until the captain himself stormed down, demanding silence, but it was too late. The crack in the crew had widened beyond repair, and when the next raid came, a brutal clash with a British merchantman bristling with Marines, the sea itself seemed to demand blood, cannon fire ripping holes in the hull, men screaming as iron tore them apart, the deck turned slick with gore, and the surgeon's table was swarmed once more. Bodies laid out, screams filling the air, and Finch worked like a demon, sawing, stitching, pouring black brews down gasping throats, his face unreadable, his eyes alight with something more than duty, and Carter, wounded but alive, watched him with hatred that eclipsed even the fear of death, muttering, "He saves us only to keep us for his own." And when the battle ended and the prizes were counted, more pirates lived than should have, more than ever before, and the men stared at one another in dread, realizing that Finch had again cheated the sea of its due. And that night, as lanterns flickered and the wounded moaned, Carter gathered the boldest and whispered of mutiny, of casting the surgeon overboard, of breaking the curse that bound them. And though fear twisted their guts, some nodded, because they would rather face death than the surgeon's endless experiments. And so they plotted, waiting for the right night when storm and silence would mask their deed. But the sea has ears, and perhaps so did Finch. For when that night came, when thunder rolled and waves hammered the hull, when Carter and 3 others crept toward Finch's chamber with blades drawn, they found him waiting, lantern burning low, scalpel already in hand, his eyes calm, as if he had known all along, and he said quietly, "The sea told me," and the men froze, their courage shriveling, but Carter lunged anyway, knife flashing, only to be caught, his wrist twisted with unnatural speed. His own blade turned against him, cutting deep into his flesh, and Finch whispered as he worked, "Balance must be kept," and the others fled in terror, leaving Carter's screams to mingle with the storm. And when dawn came, he was gone, no body, no blood, only his empty hammock swaying, and the crew dared not ask where he had gone, for in their hearts they knew the surgeon had given him to the sea. After that, silence reigned aboard the Black Widow, men obeying with hollow eyes, no longer whispering mutiny, no longer daring to even curse his name, and yet the dread grew heavier, until even Briggs muttered, "We've sold our souls to him." And then, one night under a moonless sky, the sea rose in fury, waves crashing, sails tearing, lightning splitting the heavens, and the Black Widow groaned, as if the ocean itself had come to collect its due. And amid the chaos Finch worked still, binding wounds, cutting, stitching, his calm unshaken as water poured through the deck. And the men cried out to God, to the sea, to anything that would hear them, and some swore they saw shapes in the waves, pale and writhing like the maggots in Finch's jars, reaching for the ship, whispering in voices that echoed like the dead. And through it all Finch only murmured, "The sea already has us," and as lightning struck the mainmast and split it in two, as the ship lurched and cracked, men screamed and leaped into the black water. But Finch stood unmoving, his lantern burning steady, his blades gleaming even in the storm. And when the hull split and the sea poured in, swallowing the Black Widow, the last thing the survivors remembered was Finch's voice whispering, "Balance," before the waves closed over them. Days later, wreckage washed ashore on a barren Cape-length's barrels, a few bodies torn by shark's butt, no sign of Elias Finch, no surgeon, no blades, no lantern. And the few who crawled alive onto the sand swore in broken voices that they had seen him standing on the deck as it went under, smiling, untouched by fear, as if he belonged to the sea itself. And so the legend was born, that Finch had not drowned but had been taken by the ocean, claimed as its own surgeon, cursed to wander beneath the waves, tending the drowned and the damned. And sailors whispered that on stormy nights, when the sea heaved and the sky split with lightning, a faint lantern glow could be seen moving just below the surface, and if you listened close, you could hear the rasp of a saw, the hiss of a blade through flesh, and the screams of the dead carried on the wind. And some swore that those who ignored the warnings, who followed the glow, were never seen again. Was Elias Finch truly a man who saved pirates with crude skill, or was he something darker, a servant of the deep who traded lives to keep the balance? No one could ever say, but the story spread from port to port, whispered in taverns and folksleys, and every pirate who heard it shivered, clutching his rum, because if it was true, then death by cannon or rope was mercy compared to falling into the surgeon's hands. For on the sea there are worse fates than dying. There is being kept alive by Elias Finch, only to be claimed by the sea itself.